thank everyone for joining us today for the 2024 Richard and Barbara Hansen Distinguished Lecture. I'm Edith Parker. I'm the Dean of the College of Public Health, and I'm delighted that you're here with us today for this special presentation. I want to welcome all of those in attendance here today, in particular our guests who accompanied today's speaker, as well as University of Iowa President Barb Wilson. Can you raise your hand? University of Iowa Provost and Executive Vice President Kevin Kriegel, and University of Iowa Vice President for Medical Affairs and Dean of the Carver College of Medicine, Denise Jameson. Thank y'all for joining us this morning. I also want to welcome those who are joining us remotely and let everybody know that today's lecture is being recorded and will be available through the College of Public Health website after today's event. One other logistical note, there are cards, I believe, that were either passed out or to folks, and as the presentation goes on, if you want have a question to ask, if you can write that down, we'll collect those and have a sample of those after Dr. Kim's talk. The Richard and Barbara Hansen Award is our college's highest honor. Through this program, we have the opportunity each year to recognize a national or international leader who has made significant and sustained contributions to the field of public health. This award allows our college to recognize outstanding individuals, invite them to campus to highlight the most important public health issues of our day, and give our students, faculty, staff, and the larger, broader community of Iowa City and the university an opportunity to interact with these distinguished leaders. This year, we're proud to mark our college's 25th anniversary. And in this special year, we are delighted to present the Hansen Award to a particularly notable individual. Someone who embodies ideals that inspired the formation of our college 25 years ago, and someone whose life's work has helped shine a light on the critical role of public health and the role of bold, courageous leadership to advance health around the world. I know that our benefactors of this award, Dick and Barb Hansen, would be very pleased that the 2024 Hansen Award is being presented to one of Iowa's and our nation's most accomplished public health leaders, Dr. Yong Kim. A physician and anthropologist, Dr. Kim's career has revolved around health, education, and improving the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable. He was born in South Korea to parents who fled the violence of the Korean War and grew up in Muscatine, Iowa. He began his academic career at University of Iowa before earning a bachelor's degree at Brown University, and then became one of the first students to study jointly in a new program at that time for a medical degree from Harvard Medical School and a PhD in anthropology at Harvard University. And as I learned last night, he was quite the athlete in high school, serving as a quarterback of the football team and point guard of the basketball team. Now, as I just heard a few minutes ago, the football team lost 50 straight games. So I will say that he was resilient. So while at Harvard, he co-founded Partners in Health, a nonprofit medical organization that provides health care to poor communities on 4 continents. With Partners in Health, Dr. Kim developed treatment programs for complex deadly diseases such as multidrug-resistant tuberculosis and AIDS in the poorest areas of Haiti, Peru, and several other countries. From 2003 to 2005, Dr. Kim served as director of the World Health Organization's HIV/AIDS department. He led WHO's 3x5 initiative, the first ever global goal for AIDS treatment, which greatly expanded access to antiretroviral medication in developing countries. Following his service at WHO, Dr. Kim was chair of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, chief of the Division of Global Health Equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and director of the Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard School of Public Health. In 2009, he was named the 17th president of Dartmouth College, where he served until he was nominated to become president of the World Bank Group. During his tenure, the World Bank Group supported the development priorities of countries at levels never seen outside of a financial crisis. Today, Dr. Kim is a partner, vice chairman, and emerging markets chairman at Global Infrastructure Partners, a fund that invests in infrastructure projects across several sectors across the world. Among other honors, Dr. Kim has been recognized with the MacArthur Genius Fellowship and was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. It is my tremendous pleasure to welcome Dr. Yong Kim today for his talk on reflections on 40 years in global health, faith and things and cities.
Thanks so much, everybody. Maybe I'll come out here. It's so great to be here. I mean, I had the great thrill of just having lunch with President Wilson, Dean Jameson, our wonderful provost, and we had a great conversation about the really, really important topics. But then I got to my real question, which was, why can't the Hawkeyes score more touchdowns? And President Wilson had wonderful thoughts about that, by the way. And I say that because I've been a Hawkeye fan for like most of my, since starting when I was like in third grade. I followed the Iowa Hawkeyes, and growing up in Muscatine, just down the road, of course, our main form of entertainment was sports. The Hawkeyes, and the Hawkeyes used to have some great basketball teams, but football was always so frustrating. And then it got a lot better over time, and now we just need more touchdowns. So I want to give you, though, a little bit, this is my first time, I think, I can't remember any other time, of being able to give a talk here at the University of Iowa. And it's a great privilege and fun for me. So I just kind of, as a homeboy, having come back home, I just want to tell you a little bit about how I sort of, I've gotten on in the world. And that first photograph, again, this is not my mother, but it could have been. My mother, literally when she was 13, when the North Koreans were coming down and taking over Seoul, she had to put her own sister on her back, get in a truck, and go down to an island south of Korea to escape the incoming forces. And so her life was really built on having been a refugee. She lost her own mother. Her mother and her oldest brother went out to just buy some things in the market and never came back. And they looked and looked for her but couldn't find her. So she is a child of war. My father, who taught at the University of Iowa Dental School for 15 years, my father escaped from North Korea on his own at 19 and never saw any of his family members again. And even though we tried to make connections to North Korea, he died at a young age, unfortunately, and during that time he never was able to make contact. So Korea, I just want to give you the sense, during the war was very poor, but even in 1962, when I was a 3-year-old living in Korea, this is what the World Bank said. Korea would find it difficult without foreign aid to provide its people with more than the bare necessities of life. In more sort of day-to-day parlance, the World Bank called Korea a basket case. And in 1962, they refused to give a loan to Korea. And the World Bank gave loans to everybody, right? The poorest countries. But in 1962, Korea's GDP per capita was lower than that of Ghana, was lower than that of Somalia, and many other African countries. It was one of the poorest countries in the world. So that's the background we came from. And when we first came to the United States, we went to Dallas, Texas, because my father, who was a fully trained dentist, had to do his last 2 years of dental school again in order to get a license to practice in the United States. And he decided that as an Asian man, we had to go to some place that had no dentists so that people would allow an Asian man to put his hands in their mouth. So we moved to a tiny town called State Center, Iowa. Does anyone know State Center, Iowa? What is State Center, Iowa? What is it known for?
Center of the state.
Center of the state. State Center, Iowa is the rose capital of Iowa. Right? Town of about 2,000 people. Their dentist was retiring, and so my father came and took over the practice. But then, he had bigger aspirations. My mother wanted to study, and so she started coming back and forth to the University of Iowa from State Center. But then we moved to Muscatine. My father opened up his practice, and my mother, in 1980, was one of the first women to get a PhD in theology and religion from the University of Iowa. So our roots here run so very deep. My brother did both his undergraduate and medical education here at the University of Iowa. So we were living in Muscatine, and I show you our basketball picture. See if you can pick me out here. So basketball, we were better, but it's true. In our last year, we lost all 9 games. We kept the losing streak intact, and it was actually 56 games in a row, not 50. And we were told at the time that it was the longest losing streak in the nation. Right? Now, every time someone introduces me as the quarterback of the football team, I have to just come clean and say, well, but, we lost every single game. But growing up in Muscatine was great, and one of the best things about it was that we were close to Iowa City, and came here all the time and know the city inside and out. So I met these two, Ophelia Dahl. Ophelia Dahl, D-A-H-L is her last name. Her father was Roald Dahl, the wonderful author, and her mother was Patricia Neal, the Academy Award-winning actress. And this is Paul Farmer, who tragically passed away in Rwanda in 2022. But I met them at a pretty early stage in my career. I just finished my dissertation fieldwork in Korea, and I came and met Paul. And when I was an undergraduate at Brown, having come from Iowa, I was really excited by the Asian American student community at Brown. And there was a lot of talk about identity politics, about how you needed to know your own language, know your own culture. They said, everyone talked about going back and helping their people. So I thought my job was to go back and help the people of Korea. So I got there in '84, and then by the time I was leaving, the last thing I did was I attended the Seoul Olympic Games, right? And what I found out was that my people didn't need me, that there was really nothing I could do. There were so many things that were advancing so quickly that I came back to Harvard, where I was going to have to finish my medical training, and I wasn't quite sure now what the way forward. It was a wonderful experience. I learned how to speak Korean. I learned the situation in the country. I did my dissertation work. But then when I met Paul, Paul said to me, "Oh, really, Jim, an Asian American activist, that's the biggest problem you want to take on. Why don't you come with me to Haiti?" And so I did. Go back one step, sorry. So I went with him to Haiti, and when I went to Haiti, the Haitians asked him, "Hey, is that your brother?" Right? And if not, they said, "Is that your son?" And they called me Blanc, right? And Blanc in Creole is like French, white, right? And so I was in the middle of all these great discussions at Brown with African American and Latino students. We were just talking about, the importance of like knowing your people. And so if someone had called me Blanc in the Third World Center at Brown, I would have gotten very angry. But then I understood. I was Blanc in every single way that mattered. I got on a plane, I flew there, I had resources, I was getting this ridiculously elaborate education. And so we decided that we were going to work together and build this organization. And at first it was just Haiti, but then we went to this community, Caraballo, in the northern cone of Lima. And this is where Partners in Health really took a different direction. Before, we were just trying to provide decent health care to the poorest people in the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, the Central Plateau of Haiti. But then when we went to Caraballo, we saw very different things. You could already tell that this is a much wealthier place than anywhere in central Haiti because there are power lines. This is a place that actually had power, and a lot of the homes had running water. So it was a much more it was a less impoverished area than central Haiti. But what we found there was literally an outbreak. 50 cases in a town of 100,000 people of people suffering from what we thought was multidrug-resistant tuberculosis. And this is a public health audience, so most of you probably know it. But what it is, MDR-TB, multidrug-resistant TB, is a form of tuberculosis that's resistant to the two most powerful drugs, isoniazid and rifampicin. What we were seeing was a really well-built TB program, probably one of the best in all of the world in developing countries. TB program that was doing the standard WHO recommended treatment, but all of these people we were finding were failing treatment. And what we found was that when they failed treatment, the standard approach of the ministry was to blame the patients. They said, you're not taking your medicines, or you're doing something else, and it was to blame the patients. And at the time, and this is important history for a public health audience, at the time, the recommendation of the World Health Organization was to give the standard DOTS, DOTS, directly observed treatment, short course, 6-month short course, to patients. And if they failed, they would add a single drug, streptomycin. They would add an injectable drug, right? And anyone who studied medicine, anyone who studied infectious disease, if you ask them, what's the one thing you can never do with a TB patient? The one thing you can never do is add a single drug to a failing regimen, right? That was WHO's official recommendation for MDR-TB patients, so people who are failing therapy. And it was the first time that we'd run into this kind of sort of the bureaucratic approach to global public health. And so we found patients like this. This is Meth Gaddis, who later has become very famous, but we found patients like this who really looked like they were going to die. We thought this person is not long for this world. And my job, I spent a lot of time, I went back and forth, I learned Spanish. And one of my jobs was to take sputum samples from people like this and bring them back to the Massachusetts State Lab, because we had a friend in the Massachusetts State Lab who told us he would do the sensitivity testing. And so every time I flew through Miami, I looked at all the signs, and the signs said no fruit, no animals, no bats, but it never said no sputum. Right? So now the story has gotten out there, so I think now it does say no bodily fluids, right? But it didn't say it at the time. So we brought them back, we'd take them to the Mass State Lab, and then we would get panicked phone calls at the hospital where we were working. Who is, Jose Sanchez? Who the hell is this guy? He's got 5 drug-resistant tuberculosis. So we were able to get the sensitivity patterns, and we thought, okay, we got to treat these people. Oh, can you hear me still? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've got to treat these people. And then when we found 50 cases like this, that constituted an outbreak. This was, those of you who know the TB numbers. In the United States, the number of cases per 100,000 is 7, 8, something like that. And in Peru, it was much more. It was like 300. But to have 50 cases in one community of 100,000 was an outbreak. So what do you do about this? So we said we're going to start treating them. But what happened was we came upon the global public health elite. And the official policy of the WHO was to say, in developing countries, people with MDR-TB usually die because of effective treatment is impossible in poor countries. Based on what? What do you mean it's impossible? MDR-TB is too expensive to treat in poor countries. It attracts attention and resources from treating drug-susceptible disease. And so there was overwhelming support for this idea that you should not do anything about MDR-TB in developing countries. Right? And so we asked them, well, basic questions. What do you mean it's impossible to treat? Well, it's just too complicated. And by the way, in the United States, it costs $250,000 per patient to treat MDR-TB, which is true, but it's because most of that cost is because you have to put people in the United States in negative airflow isolation rooms, which are incredibly expensive. And they say, well, but the drugs are too expensive. So we had a meeting where we brought all the good and the great from the TB world to Harvard, and we were able to do that because one of our advisors was a former dean of the School of Public Health at Harvard. We brought all the good and the great, and I asked a very simple question to the leaders at WHO. I said, okay, do you guys know if the drugs that are so expensive, do you know if they're generic or branded? Do you know? And they looked at me and they said, we don't know, which drove me crazy. I had studied the pharmaceutical industry when I was in Korea, and I knew that if drugs go from branded to generic, the price drop in the first couple of years is 50%, and then it drops 90% after that. And so these guys at WHO, and they were all guys, these guys at WHO had declared a death sentence on everybody in developing countries living with MDR-TB, and they never bothered to find out whether this complaint about drugs being too expensive, they never bothered to find out whether the drugs were generic or non-generic or branded. They never bothered to find out. So Paul Farmer used to call it the fecklessness of the global health elite, that they really thought it was okay to declare a death sentence without finding out these basic things. So my next job was to bring the prices down. And over a very short period of time, it was so simple you wouldn't believe it, we brought the prices down anywhere from 84 to 98%. So simple. It was so simple. And to cut a longer story short, a few years later, in 2000, I was sitting in the room. And if any of you have read Mountains Beyond Mountains, Tracy Kidder's wonderful book, he tells the story of me sitting in that room. I was sending emails out from that room when policy changed. So we were successful in changing policy. There was a much more aggressive effort to treat MDR-TB everywhere. But the minute we had this success, I thought, okay, if we can do this for MDR-TB, why not for HIV in developing countries? We were so inspired by ACT UP, the Treatment Action Coalition, treatment action groups in South Africa. It was the activists, and it was really basically a very small group of activists who not only brought much more money into HIV research, but changed fundamentally the way FDA approves drugs. They sped up the process dramatically. And while most of the people in that community then really said, okay, finally we can stop worrying about HIV because we've got it under control. Once the drugs came out in 1996, we talked about the Lazarus effect of HIV treatment. It was just transformative. You could see people looking like they were dead come back to life. And of course, HIV is hardly stigmatized at all in the United States and in rich countries today, right? But for developing countries, it was exactly the same situation. Everybody in the public health community was saying, well, but okay, you can't treat HIV in Africa. You can't treat HIV in poor countries. And we were saying, what are you talking about? There are 25 million people living with HIV. And what I knew was that because HIV treatment was just pills, for MDR-TB treatment, there were really toxic pills. There were powders people had to take. We had to give them injectables for 12 months, intramuscular injections for 12 months, 6 days a week. That for us, HIV treatment was like as simple as could be. But the overwhelming consensus, and this was a different part of the Global Health Elite, they said, okay, maybe you convince people on MDR-TB, but HIV, forget it. And there are a lot of people who've remade history and said, oh yeah, we were for HIV treatment all along, but I can tell you that aside from people like Tony Fauci, Tony supported us. And what Tony said in his tremendously humble way is he said, look, I don't know how to treat people in Haiti, but if you guys tell me it's possible, I think we have to try. So Tony Fauci brought Paul Farmer with pictures like this. This is Joseph June. He came to our clinic suffering from both TB and HIV, right? And a few months later, I won't get there, right? So we found people like this, Joseph June, and we started treating them. And we had good results, which I'll show you in just a bit. But the overwhelming consensus of the Global Health Elite was that you cannot treat HIV in developing countries, and they were certain of it. Right? And so the head of USAID, this is not the head of USAID, but you'll see in a second, the head of USAID, Andrew Natsios, was testifying before Congress, and the question they asked him was, should we treat HIV in Africa? And this is what he said.
Travel to rural Africa, you know this. People do not know what watches and clocks are. They do not use Western means for telling the time. They use the sun. These drugs have to be administered during a certain sequence of time during the day. And when you say, take it at 10 o'clock, people will say, what do you mean by 10 o'clock?
All right. Now, I want you to know, I don't blame Mr. Natsios. He's not a physician. And he was being told by the physicians at he was the head of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. He was told by people at the at USAID, the physicians, that please don't talk about HIV treatment. It's not possible, it's not feasible, it's too expensive. And he was just trying to add his own flair, right? He wanted to show people that he'd visited Africa before. And by the way, my friends from Africa who hosted him on a visit just before this testimony said, oh yeah, we heard that Mr. Natsio said that, but he was the only one that was late for every meeting. And I'm sure there are people here from Africa, it's just not true that people have no sense of time. Right? And so we had patients like this, and after a very short amount of treatment, they look like this. Right? And I put later, as the story goes, I use these pictures very effectively, but Paul took them, Tony Fauci took Paul, a physician from Uganda, Peter Mugenyi, he took them to the White House, And they showed these pictures and they talked about treating HIV in poor countries to some of the most important people. At the time, Michael Gerson, President Bush's speechwriter, who was kind of the conscience of the group, and Josh Bolton, who was the chief of staff. And they were so moved, they showed them to President Bush. And on January 20th, 2003, against all probability, we had no idea he was going to do this, he announced that he was going to treat HIV in Africa. So when President Bush said it, it was so unexpected, everyone had to switch on a dime, and they did. So all the people at Harvard School of Public Health who were certain told us we were crazy to even think about treating HIV, overnight became HIV treatment activists. And they got tons of money from PEPFAR to do treatment, but they were doing it, almost begrudgingly. They were saying, okay, we'll take the money, but you can't really do this. It's impossible to do. You can't treat people with HIV. So on that same day, January 28, 2003, I had been running the campaign of Dr. J.W. Lee, Jong-wook Lee, a fellow Korean, and he was head of the TB department. But on the morning, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, he was elected as the next Director General of WHO. That evening, President Bush gave that speech. So many things changed. My friend became head of WHO, and so I went there and I said, I'll come and I'll work with you, but only if you let me do something that changes completely the prospects for treatment for HIV. So we set a target. And even after President Bush said we're going to treat HIV, there was so much anger, so much resentment. And again, they said, but how are you going to possibly do this? The drugs are so expensive. So the one thing that we did at WHO that made all the difference was we created essentially a global FDA, a Global Food and Drug Administration, that went out to China, to India, to find generic manufacturers who would make these drugs, and then they approved them because the individual countries, Malawi, Zambia, these countries did not have the capacity to assess the quality of drugs. So we created our own sort of mini FDA inside WHO and gave approval for the drugs. And so for the Global Fund, which was not only U.S. money, they said, okay, we don't mind using generic drugs. If you get approval from WHO, you can use these drugs in the Global Fund program. So that was huge. Then PEPFAR, which didn't want to go against the pharmaceutical industry, they didn't know what to do. So they basically did exactly the same thing. They gave pre-approval to generic versions to be used only in PEPFAR programs. So today, it's amazing what's happened. 30 million people on treatment, probably 23, 24 million people on treatment in Africa. And I can tell you from putting on my World Bank hat, if we had done what everyone was saying we should do and not treated HIV in Africa, the sub-Saharan African economy would collapse. And what happens when an economy collapses and there's no available treatment? People flee and they go elsewhere. And they probably would have headed north through the continent and into Europe. Right? So we dodged a huge bullet. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we had these incredible successes, and it really defined my career in a way. After getting home from the World Health Organization, after we got to the end of the 3x5 campaign, my big concern was, with all the money now that was coming in for HIV treatment, and in addition to tuberculosis and malaria, it's like the dog caught the car, right? We were yapping, more money, and all of a sudden they had all this money. And so the question for me was, what do you do when the dog catches the car? So we actually invented something called the science of global health delivery. And there are now master's programs at Dartmouth, at Harvard, in China, in Africa. And we created this field so that people who were implementing these programs could share best practices. And it looked much more like a business school type discipline than the traditional public health disciplines. But global health delivery is still going strong. Now, right after I got back and started this global health delivery, I got a call from a friend of mine, who I had recently met, and he happened to be the head of the Dartmouth College Presidential Search Committee. And he said, hey, how would you like to interview for being president of Dartmouth? And I said, look, Dartmouth was notorious for being the seat of the most conservative ideology anywhere, and this was back in the 1980s. But he said, Dartmouth has changed a lot. Why don't you interview? So I interviewed with the headhunter. He interviewed me for about 3 hours. He'd read everything I'd ever written. He talked to a lot of people. And at the end of the interview, he said, hey, Jim, you're an interesting guy, but there's no way you'll get this job. And I thought, okay, this is a great experience no matter what. It's John Isaacson, President Wilson, who I'm sure you know. And he's still a very good friend of mine today. And he went back to the admissions committee and the admissions group. And he presented me and he said, this guy's completely inappropriate. He's never been a dean. He's never been a provost. He's never done any of the other things. He's an interesting guy, but he's not right for the job. But then he called me back and he said, Jim, I don't know what happened, but they want to meet you, right? And so at that point, I took a lesson from my mentor, Howard Hyatt, the former dean of the School of Public Health, who said to me that if ever, especially in academia, if someone asks you to look at an important job, it's your responsibility to the academic world to look at it, take a really serious look at it, go in there and give your best shot at saying how you would do it. You may not get the job, you may not want the job, but by going in there and giving them a full view of who you are and what you would do, you help them to decide what they really want. Right? So I did it. I read everything I could find on Dartmouth. I read the speeches of presidents going back into the 1700s. Right? And I found this wonderful speech given by a previous president who had worked in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's State Department. And so I waited. They asked me all these questions, and then at the end of the interview with the full board, they said, "Well, Jim, why do you want to be president of Dartmouth?" And I said, "You know what? I never came to this game wanting to be president of anything. Right? But you guys all know the great President John Sloan Dickey." And of course, everyone shook their head because he was a legendary figure at Dartmouth. I said, "Well, in his very first convocation in 1946." John Sloan Dickey said to the men of Dartmouth, that's all there were, he said, and I want to leave you with two thoughts. The first is that the world's troubles are your troubles. Now, this was the guy who worked in FDR's State Department, so when he said that, it really meant something. The world's troubles are your troubles. But then he finished by saying, but the second thing I want you to know is that because the world, that because the worst troubles of the world come from within the hearts of men. Now remember, he was only addressing men. Because the worst troubles of the world come from within the hearts of men, there's nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix. So you see, I still remember it, and I committed it to memory, and I said that at the end of my interview. And I swear, some of these people were like the biggest private equity. They had tears coming down their eyes. So the lesson for you is always prepare. Right? Always prepare for your interview and read all the things that make up a place, because this might not have been the way Dartmouth was run always, but the idea I was trying to give them is this is the way Dartmouth could be run if you hired me. Now, in retrospect, I was probably the wrong choice to be president of Dartmouth, but and it's such a hard job. And please support President Wilson. She's doing a great job, right? She even let me ask her about why there's no touch. We're not scoring enough touchdowns. But support your president, because it's really almost an impossible job. It is the hard. I'd say right now today, being an Ivy League president is the hardest job in the United States. It's so difficult, but I learned so much. I still, I still wear my green ties. I mean, I love this place. But in the middle of it, in my third year, I got a call from a Dartmouth grad, class of 1983, Timothy Geithner, who was Secretary of the Treasury at the time. And when my office called me and said, "Hey, Tim Geithner wants to talk to you," I said, "Okay, have him call me at a certain time." And I literally had a pad of paper down because I knew that it was probably that he had a friend who had a kid who wanted to go to Dartmouth. And I was just going to write the name down, right? But he called me and he said, "Hey, how'd you like to be president of the World Bank?" And I said to him, I edited a volume that called for the closing of the World Bank on the 50th anniversary. And he said, "Yeah, we know. We've read it." And so I said, "And you still want me to come down?" "Yeah." I said, "Well, when?" He said, "Well, can you come down tomorrow to see President Obama?" And I said, "Well, how about the day after that? I go, sure, come down the day after that. So what I did was I first called the chairman of my board, who was not happy about this, but of course you have to be fully transparent. And I told him, look, there's no chance for me getting this job, but I'm gonna go down, the president's asked to see me, I have to see him. So I went down, and I walked in the room, and President Obama said to me, so Jim, why on earth should I nominate you, a physician and an anthropologist, and not a macroeconomist? And so I said to him, just right off the top of my head, I said, well, President Obama, have you ever read your mother's PhD dissertation? Okay. And he said, well, yes, I have. In that voice, yes, I have. So later, I was able to get to know him, fairly well. We played golf together. But President Obama, when he said that, I still don't know to this day whether he actually read his mother's PhD. But he's such a nerd, I bet he had. Right? And so I said, well, you remember that your mother studied the artisans, the metal sculptors in Indonesia. And she showed that while the macroeconomists predicted that globalization would destroy the metal sculpture industry, she actually showed that the metal sculptors flourished because they started selling their sculptures all over the world. Right? So I said, I'm not going to tell you, I can't tell you what the world looks like from 30,000 feet like a macroeconomist, but I've been on the ground doing real development work my whole life. I'll be able to tell you if these programs are working on the ground. He said, I get that. Later, he invited my wife and I to a dinner at the residence, and someone who was there asked me, how did you get the job? I told this story. And President Obama, drinking a martini, said, that was one of the best ploys to get a job I've ever seen. Read the president's mother. But he also knew that I couldn't have just ordered it quickly because the only place you could get it was the University of Michigan archives. Unpublished dissertations are only available there. So it took me about 2 weeks to get it and bind it and read the whole thing. So I got that job. This was the press conference in the Rose Garden when he announced that he was going to nominate me. And I was standing next to him, and the question came up from the audience, what do you think about Trayvon Martin? And this is when he said, Trayvon Martin could have been my son. Okay? And it was one of the most emotional, sort of revealing moments. But then he announced that he was going to nominate me, and he also announced my golf handicap. Because we had been talking about golf, and later we played together a lot. But I was in this job. We did a lot of things. We set a goal, a target for the end of extreme poverty. And COVID, unfortunately, has thrown that out. We're not going to reach the target by 2030. But we did other things as well. We created something called the Human Capital Index, where we look specifically at health and education indicators and how well they correlate to economic growth. And it turns out that the more you improve your health and education outcomes, the faster you grow economically. But after about 6.5 years, it felt to me like all I was doing was going to things like this. Right? And so you can tell I was getting bored because I didn't get the memo that you have to wait. I was in good company. Angela Merkel didn't wait either. Right? But for most of the history of the World Bank Group, because the presidents were not directly sort of involved in technical people around development, that's mostly what they did. So at that point I left, and I took on other things. So this is Joseph June again, right? And I just want to stop for a second and say, when I tell you this story, a lot of young people take from this story, oh my God, can you believe that people were so nearsighted? Can you believe that people were so brutally indifferent to the suffering of African people, and they thought that we shouldn't treat HIV. That's not the lesson I want you to take. The lesson I want you to take is ask yourself, what is it in 15 years that a group of students and young people in audiences just like this are going to look back and say 15 years ago, can you believe that they allowed that situation to continue? What is it that we're doing or not doing today that 15 years from today people will be incredulous that we were doing what we were doing? I would say that one of these issues is mental health. And I've heard from President Wilson, you guys are doing lots of great work here on trying to support mental health, but I was actually shocked at how bad things are. So my good friend, Tom Insel, who wrote this book called Healing, if there's one book on mental health you read Tom's book. And in it, he talks about how we've made so much progress, there's so much better treatments, more people are getting treatment than ever before, but outcomes have not gotten better. In every field, so right now, neuropsychiatric disorders are the biggest cause of the loss of DALY, disability-adjusted life years. Neuropsychiatric disorders are the largest source. And every other disease, chronic disease, stroke, heart disease, AIDS, child leukemia, from its peak has gotten better. Yeah, everything has gotten better. Everything has gone down except mental health issues, especially suicide. Right? Tom talks about deaths of despair. Right? And out of COVID, while only 7,981 young people died of COVID, at that same time, deaths of despair were 120,000. Suicides and overdoses. Right? So things got especially worse during COVID, but the outcomes still have not gotten better over time. You hear all of these stories about Americans who attempt suicide. Now the rate of suicide, especially among young girls, has gone up, and in every category things have gotten worse. And part of it is related to this crazy piece of data on loneliness that I didn't understand. A former student of mine is now the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. And Vivek, this last number scared the hell out of me. So if you answer that you are lonely on a questionnaire, it reduces your life expectancy the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And being lonely is a bigger risk factor for premature death than physical inactivity or obesity, which everyone understands is a risk factor. Now, the other thing that has just shocked me is the academic literature now on the influence of social media. Right? So, two books I'm giving you: Healing and read this book. Right? Now, there are arguments over the data, but another student of mine who was the Commissioner of Health of New York City actually did an experiment of what it meant to ban smartphones during the day in certain schools in New York. And like every other study that's been done, anxiety and depression scores all got better when social media and smartphones were eliminated from those schools. So what's happening? Right at 2010, anxiety and depression among US undergraduates went up. And 2010 was, what happened in 2010 that was so important? Did you know? The iPhone. The iPhone with cameras on both sides came on the market. And I don't think it was Steve Jobs' intention to cause a mental health epidemic like this. But the launch of the iPhone and the way that social media is very specifically focused on getting you addicted, making sure that your dopamine releases at just the right time so you keep looking, has had this kind of negative effect. If you look at the prevalence of anxiety, look how much it's gone up in all ages, all young age groups, but especially from 18 to 25. Look at how much that has increased, again, since 2010. So what's the solution for this kind of issue? I don't know. I don't know what the solution is, but I can tell you that I am so worried about the mental health crisis. And Tom, in his book, very kindly points out that what Paul Farmer talked about, one of his greatest ideas was accompaniment. We use community health workers in everything. And we've had very good health outcomes. And training people from the community in supporting others going through difficult treatments has been hugely positive. But the notion of accompaniment in general, knowing how to accompany others through difficult experiences, I think is a key idea. This is the entire formulary of the only psychiatric hospital in Liberia. That's it, that's all they've got. But by using community health workers, by doing things like task sharing, in other words, the things that a physician or a psychologist or a clinical social worker would do in the United States, we have community health workers do it. We've had wonderful outcomes. Vikram Patel, who's now the chair of the department that I used to chair, showed that if you teach cognitive behavioral therapy, just basic principles, to illiterate Indian village women, the anxiety and depression scores in those villages go down. Right? So we're in Iowa, and it's a place where we desperately need more mental health professionals, but what if we were to train people in Iowa to do some of the things that we've been doing for years in developing countries. The last thing I'm going to tell you about is I was asked by the president of Korea to help him on some things. And so I started looking at the situation in Korea. And unfortunately, I think Korea is the canary in the coal mine. Highest rates of suicide in all of OECD. In people in their teens, their 20s, and their 30s, the number one cause of death is suicide. Now, in every other advanced economy, the number one cause of death is usually accidents, and suicide is farther down the list. But in Korea, the number one cause of death among young people is suicide. Koreans have probably gotten on the high-speed internet, social media, bullying, etc., faster and sooner than everyone else. Right? And loneliness scores are the highest in OECD. Depression, estimated depression levels are 25 to 35%, highest again in OECD, whereas only 2 to 3% get treatment because mental illness is so stigmatized. And all of it collapses down into the total fertility rate. I mean, this is a public health audience. Everyone knows total fertility rate has to be 2.1 to just replace the population. So last year, Korea had the lowest total fertility rate ever measured in human history for a nation state, 0.72, I think it was. This year, the estimate is that it's going to be even lower. And so when I say this to people, people say, oh yeah, Japan has had that problem too. And I say, yes, they have, and they've been struggling with it for 20 years. And in 2024, Japan's total fertility rate will be double the total fertility rate of Korea. Korea is going to be 0.65, and Japan is 1.3. So it's not all related to mental health. There are a lot of social and cultural factors that have to be worked through, but Korea is facing demographic collapse. And believe me, it's coming for the rest of the advanced economies. It's coming for China right now. And if China goes through this, because the global economy is so dependent on the Chinese economy, this is going to have very serious implications for everybody. So the point is, I think, now the task for you guys, especially the Gen Zers who've grown up with social media, is to try to figure this out. Right? This is the thing. Last night we did a session on mental health in Muscatine, and this wonderful Ben Pohl, wonderful practitioner who sees a lot of young people, said to me, social media is this generation's cigarettes. Right? So how are we going to create healthier societies that pay attention to mental health and that get everyone who needs it to the kind of therapy they need? We did it for TB and HIV, right? And I'm still working on mental health, but we really need everyone to step up. And it might not be mental health, but find that thing which is most important to you. Now, to finish, this is me visiting Tanzania, and every time I went to do a country visit, I would go to a classroom. And here I'm in a classroom of 5th graders. And so as I always do, I asked them, so what do you all want to be when you grow up? This young boy stood up and said, I want to be president of the World Bank. Right? and just like you, the teachers in the room, my own staff, they all laughed. Right? But then I said, let me just offer you a thought. So this is me in 1962. Right? And in 1962, where that quote comes from, if George David Woods, who was the president of the World Bank at the time, if he had come to Korea to see if we were worthy of receiving a loan, and he'd come to a school like I always did, and he came to my pre-K school, would he have thought that one of his successors was sitting in that room? I don't think so. And so I leave this to you because my unbelievably improbable journey from war-torn Korea to this position, being able to lecture for the first time at the University of Iowa, as the dyed-in-the-wool Hawkeye. Remember what the great anthropologist Margaret Mead said. She said that never doubt the ability of a small group of committed souls to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, questions?
Yes, I think we have time for some questions, and please pass your cards forward, or those of you who are online, just put it into the chat box. So here's our first question, actually from the Zoom, or someone on Zoom. Can you reflect on the early approach by Partners in Health to avoid working through governments and creating parallel health systems? What changed the thinking to then work with governments?
So it was very specific. That's a great question. I mean, that's someone who really knows Partners in Health well. At first we were working in post-Duvalier Haiti, right? And there were many times. So during the brief period when Jean-Bertrand Aristide was president, we had a great relationship with the Haitian government. But in every other period, they would routinely threaten to bulldoze us, right? And so we were very wary of working with governments. And then, of course, the experience with partners with Socios en Salud in Peru, I told you we were at loggerheads. But then we came to the understanding, once the money was so much more through PEPFAR, through the Global Fund, we realized that the only institution that can participate with you in real scale-up are governments. The governments are the only ones that can guarantee the right to health, for example. So after that, as we expanded and gone into other countries, we realized that part of selecting which country we go to is that there's a government that we can work with. And so it's a maxim now for us that you've got to figure out a way to work with the government. And if it's impossible, you have to really think hard about whether you go there or not.
All right, I think we have time for one more. Historically, decisions made by the World Bank can have make or break impacts on the support and outcomes of some countries. From your tenure as president of the World Bank, can you speak about some of the leadership challenges when it comes to making these decisions and opportunities to promote and still advance equity and development?
Yeah. So we were talking about this earlier in a meeting with some of the faculty members of the School of Public Health. I really did call for the closing of the World Bank. I was part of a group called 50 Years is Enough, meaning 50 years of the World Bank is enough and we should close it. And it was just those kind of questions that we spoke about. But let me just give you one example, or a few examples. One is the human capital work that we did. That when you pick the right things and really focus on them in a way that is evidence-based, the World Bank can be the most influential development institution, even global health institution in the world. And the foundation of the World Bank is something that I didn't really understand. It's sort of like a hat trick. It's like a party or magic trick, where we take all the credit ratings of all the governments in the world, put them all together, which makes the credit rating incredibly strong, and that it allows World Bank as an institution to borrow on capital markets at the lowest possible rates. And then what the bank does is it passes that on to the countries. And so for the poorest countries, yes, there are loans, but the so-called IDA loans, International Development Association loans, are 10 years of grace period. You don't have to pay anything back. And then you pay it back over 30 years at 0% interest. So what that means is that instead of getting just a grant for a small amount of money, you get a much larger amount because you're leveraging it by raising money in the capital markets, and you're getting direct grants from pledges from the governments to buy down the interest so it goes to zero. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody that IDA loans, 40 years at 0%, are incredibly popular among the leaders of just about, I can't think of a single country that doesn't love to get IDA loans. And the reason that the World Bank borrows at such low rates is because we're essentially guaranteed by all of our quote-unquote shareholders. And there's a concept called callable capital, which is one of the great ideas of all time. And the idea is that if the World Bank ever gets in trouble, each of the countries that are shareholders are holding in reserve billions, I think it's now hundreds of billions of dollars in callable capital that they'll send to us if we need it. Now, it's a huge fiction because if the bank were ever run so poorly that it had to call the capital, that would mean that it's probably going to close its doors. But having that fiction in place allows the bank to borrow those of you who know the financial world a little bit, LIBOR is the rate at which banks trade with each other, right? Sort of no profit trading with each other. The U.S. Treasury, the rate that they pay for people who buy Treasury bonds is LIBOR minus like 50, LIBOR minus 0.5%. So even lower than the interbank trading rate. When I was at the bank, we borrowed at LIBOR minus 0.25%. So not quite as good as US Treasuries, but almost. So having that credit rating is so important, because one of the things I've learned is that rich people use leverage, these kinds of loans, all the time to make themselves wealthier. It's just the most common thing to do, because debt is the cheapest way to do anything, right? And for the people in finance, you'll understand this, but why not take the tools of the wealthiest people that they've used so effectively to make themselves wealthier and use it on behalf of the poor? So that is in essence what the bank is supposed to do. Has the bank been on one side of an issue that has gotten certain people angry? Yes, absolutely. The bank has had to make choices. But we've also made good choices. When I got to the World Bank, we were literally outcasts in the climate change world. They literally, when they had the Copenhagen Agreement, the World Bank staff were not allowed in the room for the discussions because we were doing so little on climate change. And so we pledged, I personally pledged, that we would go from almost nothing for climate change to 30 billion. And I think they just got over 30 billion a few years ago. So, we went from being nowhere on climate change to being now the largest player in climate change. And so the bank, the mechanism of using leverage and using the credit rating, this is something that we've got to keep. Now, what programs we focus on, which specific things we do, that'll always be debatable. But I just don't, I believe now that we would be so stupid to give up this incredible position that the World Bank is in.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. I think we are thrilled to know that we are the first college to host you on campus, and we hope that we can continue doing this while President Wilson works on the football offense.
Go Hawks!
Yes. So one more time, let's